He cheated all night. But the divorce waiting at home destroyed the Korean billionaire CEO. Power doesn't announce its departure. It slips away in the shadows while you're still admiring yourself in the mirror, still believing the applause, still convinced that loyalty is a given and consequences are for lesser men. Ji-hoon Park had stopped questioning his invincibility years ago. At 38, he was the youngest chairman in Hanwol Dynamic's 70-year history. While other Korean conglomerates stumbled through scandals and succession wars, Ji-hoon had transformed a traditional manufacturing company into a biotech empire worth $43 billion. Forbes called him a visionary. The Financial Times dubbed him Korea's pharmaceutical prodigy. Politicians sought his counsel. Rivals studied his strategies like scripture. He had earned the right to take what he wanted. The Jeju Island villa sprawled across 3 acres of volcanic coastline, invisible to prying eyes, accessible only to those who understood that discretion was the true luxury of the elite. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the East China Sea like a painting commissioned specifically for his pleasure. Naeun emerged from the infinity pool, water cascading off her model-esque frame, designer bikini clinging in ways that made Ji-hoon forget why men ever pretended to value substance over beauty. "You're magnificent," she purred, settling onto his lap with practiced ease. Her fingers traced the collar of his silk robe, brioni, custom-made, worth more than most Koreans earned in 6 months. "The presentation last week? Revolutionary. You're not just changing medicine, you're playing God." Ji-hoon smiled, letting her words wash over him like warm rain. This was what he deserved. Not the tedious board meetings, not the exhausting pretense of humility journalists expected, not the performance of being a devoted husband to a woman who'd long ago stopped fascinating him. Naeun understood what Layla never could, that extraordinary men operated by different rules. His wife. Dr. Layla Kim Park. Tenure-track professor, classical music enthusiast, the woman who looked perfect in photographs and said all the right things at corporate galas. Elegant. Educated. Safe. Predictable. She'd been the logical choice 8 years ago when image mattered and his father's traditional values still held sway over succession plans. Layla brought respectability, a PhD from Cambridge, old soul family connections, the kind of quiet grace that played well in conservative boardrooms. But she'd never challenged him. Never matched his ambition. Never understood that men like him needed more than companionship, they needed worship, admiration, the constant confirmation of their exceptionalism. Naeun's phone chimed. She glanced at it, then back at Ji-hoon with that intoxicating mixture of desire and deference. "Sunrise in an hour. Will you stay?" He should leave. Layla expected him home by morning, some university function she'd mentioned, another tedious faculty dinner where he'd play the supportive spouse while professors droned about research grants. "Of course," Ji-hoon said, pulling Naeun closer. "I'll tell her the Singapore investors needed an early call." She never questions these things. Because Layla never questioned anything. That was the beauty of marrying someone grateful for the privilege of being Mrs. Park. Someone who understood her role and stayed in it. His phone sat on the marble side table, silent and benign. No suspicious calls. No confrontations. No consequences. The villa's sound system played soft jazz, expensive wine waited in crystal glasses, and the woman in his arms looked at him like he'd hung the moon specifically for her benefit. Ji-hoon Park felt untouchable. What he didn't know, what his arrogance had made impossible to imagine, was that 300 kilometers away in their Seoul penthouse, his wife wasn't sleeping. She was sitting in her study, surrounded by 8 years of meticulously organized evidence, reviewing documents he'd forgotten existed, and making final preparations for a war he didn't know had already begun. The quiet ones don't stay silent forever. They just choose their moment with surgical precision. The penthouse was too quiet. Ji-hoon noticed it the moment the private elevator opened directly into the foyer, that particular quality of silence that signals absence rather than peace. No subtle classical music drifting from Layla's study. No housekeeper preparing breakfast in the kitchen. No familiar rhythm of a home occupied by people performing their designated roles. Just emptiness with excellent acoustics. He dropped his keys on the console table, Italian marble, sourced personally from Carrara, and loosened his tie. The lies had flowed easily during the drive from Jeju. Traffic. Last-minute investor concerns. His assistant would confirm the fabricated schedule if Layla bothered to ask, which she never did. Except Layla wasn't here to lie to. Mrs. Park. He moved through the living room, noting details his brain catalogued but hadn't yet processed into alarm. The staff usually arrived by 6. It was nearly 8. The kitchen gleamed and used. No coffee brewing. No breakfast arranged on the Wedgwood china Layla insisted on for weekend mornings. Ji-hoon pulled out his phone, irritation beginning to eclipse confusion. Where was everyone? This wasn't how his household operated. He paid people obscene salaries specifically so that everything functioned seamlessly, invisibly, without requiring his attention. He called Layla's number. It rang once, then diverted to a generic voicemail, not her usual greeting. The first whisper of unease crawled down his spine. His study door stood open. Unusual. Layla respected his private workspace with almost neurotic precision. He crossed the threshold and stopped. On his desk, the custom zebrawood monstrosity that had cost more than a luxury sedan, sat a cream-colored folder. Resting on top of it, arranged with deliberate ceremony, was Layla's wedding ring. The 3-carat diamond caught the morning light, throwing tiny rainbows across documents he hadn't yet read. Ji-hoon picked up the ring, its familiar weight suddenly foreign in his palm. He opened the folder. Petition for divorce. Petitioner, Dr. Layla Kim Park. Respondent, Park Ji-hoon. He laughed. Actually laughed, a sharp bark of disbelief that echoed in the empty penthouse. This was absurd. Layla didn't make power moves. Layla attended faculty meetings and organized charity fundraisers and looked elegant in photographs. She certainly didn't file for divorce like some spurned housewife from a Mac Jang drama. His eyes scanned the petition, still half smiling at the preposterous theater of it all. Then he saw the attachments. Photograph 1, Ji-hoon and Na-eun entering the Shilla Hotel. Date stamped. Time coded. His hand on her lower back. Photograph 2, the Cartier receipt for the diamond bracelet he'd bought Na-eun last month. Paid with the credit card Layla had never monitored because she trusted him to manage their finances. Photograph 3, a different hotel. A different woman, Min-ji, the venture capitalist he'd entertained in Tokyo last spring. Same familiar gesture, same arrogant carelessness. The pages kept coming. Bank statements highlighted in yellow. Wire transfers to accounts he thought were discreet. Text messages. How did she get his text messages, laid out in chronological order like evidence in a prosecution file? 8 years of infidelity, documented with the methodical precision of a scholar building an airtight thesis. Ji-hoon's hands had started trembling. He set the folder down, stepped back, ran his fingers through his hair. This wasn't real. This was leverage, some desperate bid for attention, for renegotiation of whatever imaginary grievances she'd constructed. Except the evidence was real. The photographs didn't lie. The dates, the transactions, the meticulous timeline of his betrayals, all presented with the cold professionalism of someone who'd stopped feeling and started calculating. He grabbed his phone, dialed Layla again. Voicemail. Called the housekeeper. Disconnected number. His driver. No longer in service. The penthouse, he suddenly realized, wasn't just quiet. It had been evacuated. Ji-hoon Park stood alone in his $40 million home, surrounded by Italian marble and custom furniture and all the trappings of power, holding evidence of his own destruction compiled by the woman he'd dismissed as too soft to matter. The quiet one hadn't just known. She'd been preparing. And he'd been too arrogant to notice the cage being built around him, one documented infidelity at a time. Ji-hoon's hands shook as he flipped through the divorce petition, past the photographs, past the timeline of betrayals, until he reached the section that made his blood run cold. Enforcement of prenuptial agreement, Clause 9b. The words blurred, then sharpened into focus with devastating clarity. In the event of marital dissolution due to documented infidelity by either party, the offending spouse forfeits all claims to marital assets, including but not limited to, primary residence, investment portfolios, business equity held in joint accounts, and any properties acquired during the marriage regardless of whose name appears on title deeds. No. He read it again. Then a third time, each word landing like a physical blow. Furthermore, any assets transferred to the non-offending spouse prior to marriage, including shares, trusts, or capital investments made in the other spouse's business ventures, shall be subject to immediate recall with interest calculated at standard commercial lending rates. Ji-hoon's legs gave out. He sank into his desk chair, the ergonomic masterpiece he'd imported from Germany, and stared at language he'd seen before but never actually processed. 8 years ago rushed back with cruel precision. His father's office. The old man's traditional paranoia about protecting family assets. Marriage is a business arrangement, Ji-hoon. Beautiful women are expensive. Make sure this one can't bankrupt you if she gets ideas. Ji-hoon had commissioned Korea's most aggressive matrimonial attorney, a shark who designed a prenup that protected the Park family fortune like a fortress. He'd presented it to Layla 3 weeks before the wedding, sliding the 100-page document across the table at Jungsik restaurant with barely concealed condescension. Just a formality, he'd said, signaling the waiter for more wine. Standard protection. You understand. Layla had been so quiet that night. Delicate fingers turning pages, her expression unreadable behind those scholarly glasses she wore. She'd asked for 2 days to review it with her own attorney. He'd laughed. Of course. Take your time. Assuming, knowing, she'd sign whatever he put in front of her. Women like Layla didn't walk away from men like him over paperwork. The ring on her finger cost more than her annual salary. The life he offered was worth any contractual inconvenience. She'd signed without argument. He'd never read the final version. Why would he? His attorney had drafted it. His interests were protected. Layla was too grateful, too intellectually minded, too foreign to Korean business culture to negotiate effectively. She'd probably been overwhelmed by the legal jargon, intimidated by the process, relieved just to have it finished. Except now, staring at Clause 9b, Ji-hoon saw what he'd missed. The clause cut both ways. If he cheated, when documented evidence proved infidelity, he didn't just lose marital assets. He lost everything Layla had brought into the marriage. Everything she'd invested in him. His mind raced through implications his arrogance had made invisible. The penthouse. Purchased 3 years ago. Layla had contributed 40% of the down payment from her family trust. He'd barely registered it, just numbers moving between accounts, her dutiful contribution to their shared life. The Jeju Villa. Renovated with funds from her inheritance after her father died. He'd thanked her perfunctorily, already planning which mistress would christen the master suite. And Hanwol Dynamics. Oh God. Hanwol Dynamics. Ji-hoon's hands scrambled through the petition, pages scattering across zebrawood, until he found the attachment that confirmed his nightmare. Schedule A, Investment Holdings. There, in merciless columns, Layla's initial investment in Hanwol Dynamics 7 years ago. $12 million transferred from her doctoral research fund, money her grandfather had left specifically for her academic career. Money Ji-hoon had needed desperately when the biotech pivot required capital his father refused to provide. Money Layla had offered quietly, without fanfare, with only a simple request: make it official. Let me be part of what you're building. He'd given her shares. 8% of the company, structured through a trust he'd immediately forgotten about because Layla never mentioned it, never attended board meetings, never acted like an investor. She'd acted like a wife, while actually being a shareholder with recall rights. Ji-hoon stood abruptly, knocking his chair backward. Rage flooded through him, not at Layla, but at himself. At his own suffocating arrogance. At the assumptions that had blinded him to the most basic due diligence. She hadn't been weak. She'd been patient. She hadn't been ignorant. She'd been strategic. She hadn't been reacting to his betrayal. She'd been executing a plan 8 years in the making. The prenup he'd forced her to sign, the document meant to protect him from her, had been the weapon she'd used to ensure his complete destruction. Ji-hoon Park, youngest chairman in Hanwol Dynamics history, biotech visionary, Korea's pharmaceutical prodigy, stood in his empty penthouse holding legal proof that he'd built his empire on a foundation owned by the woman he'd systematically betrayed. The quiet one hadn't just held the keys to his cage. She'd owned the cage from the beginning. The call came at 9:47 a.m. Min Jae's name flashed on Ji-hoon's screen, his COO, his college roommate, the man who'd stood beside him through every corporate battle for 15 years. Finally, an ally. Someone who'd help him understand this insanity, mobilize legal resources, remind the world who actually built Hanwol Dynamics. Min Jae, thank God. Listen, Layla's lost her mind. She's filed for. There's an emergency board meeting. Min Jae's voice was flat, professional, stripped of familiarity. 10th floor. You need to be here in 30 minutes. What? I didn't call a board meeting. Who authorized? Layla did. The line went dead. Ji-hoon stared at his phone, Min Jae's words echoing in the silence of his empty penthouse. Layla called a board meeting. Layla, who'd attended exactly 2 corporate events in 8 years, who claimed boredom with business politics, who'd never once asked about quarterly reports. He dressed mechanically, Tom Ford suit, Hermes tie, the armor of power. Whatever game she was playing, the board would see reason. These were his people. His company. Men who understood that brilliant leadership occasionally came with personal complications. The drive to Hanwol headquarters took 12 minutes. Ji-hoon's former driver, wasn't available, forcing him to take his own car like some mid-level manager. He white-knuckled the steering wheel, rehearsing the speech that would reframe this humiliation as a private matter, a misunderstanding, nothing that concerned corporate governance. The executive elevator required his biometric scan. It failed 3 times before security manually overrode it. First red flag. The 10th floor boardroom doors stood open. Every seat filled, all 12 board members present, plus the company's general counsel and 2 attorneys Ji-hoon didn't recognize. The wall of windows framed Seoul's skyline like a jury box. And there, in the chair traditionally reserved for external auditors, sat Layla. She wore Dior, navy, structured, severe. Her hair pulled back in a style he'd never seen, elegant and ruthlessly professional. No jewelry except pearl earrings. She looked like someone who'd stopped performing softness and embraced exactness. She looked dangerous. Chairman Park, the lead attorney began before Ji-hoon could speak. Please sit. What is this? Ji-hoon remained standing, scanning faces for support. Min Jae wouldn't meet his eyes. Director Choi studied papers. Director Han examined her manicure with sudden fascination. A reconvening of the board, Layla said quietly, to address material misrepresentations regarding company ownership structure. Her voice was different. Not the gentle academic tone he knew. This was the voice of someone who'd studied power and learned to wield it like a scalpel. The attorney slid a document across the mahogany table. Dr. Kim Park holds 18% of Hanwol Dynamics through the Jemison Family Trust, established by her grandfather in 2009. These shares were acquired through direct capital investment and convertible instruments between 2017 and 2023. 18%. Ji-hoon's vision tunneled. That's impossible. I gave her 8%. 7 years ago. One time. Your initial transfer was 8%, the attorney confirmed. Dr. Kim Park subsequently purchased an additional 10% through 6 separate transactions, using funds from her family trust. All properly documented, filed with Korean regulators, and approved by this board. The board knew. Ji-hoon's voice cracked. Director Choi finally looked up. The Jemison Trust is our third largest shareholder, Chairman Park. Of course we knew. The room tilted. Ji-hoon gripped the chair back for balance. Every transaction Layla made, every share she acquired, every strategic investment, approved and recorded while he'd been too arrogant to notice, too busy chasing pleasure to attend to details. Furthermore, Layla spoke again, each word measured. The prenuptial agreement you required me to sign includes recall provisions for any marital assets or investments transferred during our marriage. Given the documented evidence of infidelity, she gestured to a folder identical to the one in his study. I'm exercising those provisions. You can't. I already have. She stood, matching his height in Louboutin heels. The recalled shares, combined with my existing holdings, give me 24% of Hanwol Dynamics. The single largest individual shareholder position. The attorneys presented another document. A board resolution. Termination of Chairman Park Jae-hoon, effective immediately. Appointment of interim chairman, Dr. Layla Kim Park. 10 signatures. Every board member except him. Ji-hoon's knees buckled. He caught himself on the chair, but the damage was done. Korea's youngest chairman, physically collapsing in front of the board that had just executed him. Security will escort you out, Layla said, her tone empty of triumph or malice. Just finality. Your corporate accounts are frozen. Building access revoked. You have 72 hours to remove personal items from your office. Min Jae stood, wouldn't look at him. The other directors filed out silently, their loyalty evaporating like morning fog. Ji-hoon tried Layla's eyes, searching for the woman he'd married. She met his gaze with the cool assessment of someone examining a specimen under glass, interesting once, now thoroughly studied, ultimately disposable. How long, he whispered. How long what? How long have you been planning this? Layla collected her documents, slipped them into a leather portfolio. Since the day you made me sign a prenup designed to protect you from me, then forgot to read the version I actually signed. She walked past him, Louboutins clicking on marble, leaving him alone in the boardroom that had been his kingdom. His phone lay silent on the table. No calls. No texts. No allies. The quiet one had taken everything while he was busy thinking he owned the world. Ji-hoon sat in his car in the Hanwol parking garage, the company's parking garage, engine running, phone clutched in shaking hands. The fluorescent lights hummed above him like a mechanical requiem for his career. He needed someone. Anyone. A voice that would say this wasn't real, that he was still the man he'd been yesterday, that his value hadn't evaporated with a board resolution. Na-eun would understand. Beautiful, devoted Na-eun, who'd whispered that he was magnificent just 12 hours ago. Who looked at him like he'd personally arranged the stars for her benefit. His finger hovered over her contact, then pressed call. It rang. And rang. Anne. Ji-hoon, I can't talk right now. Her voice was rushed, panicked, nothing like the sultry purr he knew. Na-eun, something's happened. I need to see you. The peninsula, our usual. Are you insane? She practically hissed into the phone. Have you seen the news? What news? Check your phone. Check any phone. It's everywhere. Ji-hoon pulled his phone away, opened his news app with numb fingers. The top story loaded with the casual brutality of digital media. Hanwol Dynamics chairman ousted in corporate coup, wife takes control after infidelity scandal. Below it, photographs. Him and Na-eun at the Jeju villa, zoomed and crystal clear. Him and Minji in Tokyo. 3 other women he'd barely remembered until their faces appeared on his screen, each image time-stamped, geotagged, presented like evidence in a public trial. His private hell had gone viral. "They're calling me a homewrecker," Naun said, voice cracking. "My Instagram has 10,000 comments. My agency dropped me this morning. This morning, Ji-hoon. They're saying I slept my way into corporate access, that I will fix this. I'll release a statement. My lawyers. Your lawyers." She laughed, a sharp hysterical sound. "You don't have lawyers anymore. You don't have a company. You don't have anything except a scorned wife who apparently owns everything you thought was yours." The words landed like physical blows. "Naun, please. Just meet me. We can figure this out together." Silence stretched between them, filled only by her shallow breathing. "Did you use corporate funds?" she finally asked. "What? The hotels. The jewelry. The Jeju villa weekends." Her voice had gone cold, calculating. "Did you pay for me with company money?" Ji-hoon's mind raced through blurred memories of credit cards and wire transfers. Some of it was, the corporate card covered certain. Oh my God. Pure horror now. "My lawyer says if you use corporate funds for personal affairs, I could be charged as an accomplice to embezzlement. Do you understand what you've done to me? Naun, I would never let that happen. I'll protect you." "Protect me?" She was crying now, but it sounded like rage wrapped in tears. "Protect me with what? Your demolished reputation. Your frozen bank accounts. You told me you were untouchable, Ji-hoon. You said men like you lived by different rules. I was. You were a wallet with a decent face," she cut him off. "And now you're not even that." The line went dead. Ji-hoon stared at his phone, her words echoing in the enclosed space. A wallet with a decent face. He'd said almost the exact same thing about Layla once, hadn't he? To Min-jae, drunk after some corporate event. "She's convenient, respectable family, doesn't ask questions, looks good in photos. The perfect corporate wife. Transactional. Useful. Disposable when something better came along." He discarded Layla's emotions like inconvenient paperwork, never questioning whether she actually loved him because it hadn't mattered. She served a function. That was enough. And Naun? Minji? All the others who'd whispered that he was magnificent, extraordinary, worth betraying vows for. They'd valued the chairman of Hanwol Dynamics. The man with unlimited corporate cards and private villas and the power to change their social standing with a phone call. They'd never valued Ji-hoon Park the man, because there was no man beneath the title. Just arrogance wearing expensive suits. His phone buzzed. Not Naun calling back. A news alert. Model Neun releases statement, "I was manipulated by powerful man who hid his marriage." Ji-hoon's laugh came out broken, bitter. She was already rewriting history, recasting herself as victim rather than accomplice. Protecting her brand while his burned. Exactly what he would have done. Exactly what he'd taught her by example. He'd built a life on using people, their affection, their labor, their capital, while giving nothing real in return. He'd surrounded himself with transactional relationships and called it power. Now, stripped of title and money and status, he was learning the true price of that philosophy. Nobody loved Ji-hoon Park. They'd loved what he could give them. And the woman he'd married, the quiet one he dismissed as too soft to matter, had been the only person honest enough to never pretend otherwise. She'd signed a contract. Fulfilled her obligations. And when he broke the terms, she'd executed the exit clause with the cold precision of someone who'd never confused business with emotion. Ji-hoon sat alone in the parking garage, surrounded by the imported leather and German engineering he could no longer afford, and finally understood what Layla had known from the beginning. He'd never been untouchable. He'd just never met someone patient enough to document his fall. Ji-hoon's black Amex was declined at the GS25 convenience store. He stood at the counter, protein bar and bottled water in hand, while the teenage cashier scanned the card a second time. Then a third. The machine beeped its rejection with mechanical indifference. Try this one. Ji-hoon handed over his backup card, the platinum visa reserved for emergencies. Declined. The corporate card. Declined. A line had formed behind him. A woman in yoga pants sighed audibly. The teenager's expression shifted from confusion to recognition. Ji-hoon watched it happen in real time as the kid's eyes widened, then darted to the phone propped beside the register. The news story. His face plastered across every portal. I'll just take these back. Ji-hoon grabbed the items, retreated without the basic dignity of bottled water. Outside, Seoul's afternoon humidity wrapped around him like wet wool. His phone buzzed with cascade of notifications, not concerned friends, but automated messages. Your American Express account has been suspended. Seoul Country Club membership terminated effective immediately. Your reservation at Mingles has been cancelled by management. Porsche Financial Services, payment 47 days overdue. Vehicle subject to repossession. 47 days. Layla had been executing this for 47 days while he'd been horizontal in Jeju, confident in his invincibility. Ji-hoon's hands shook as he scrolled through the digital dismantling of his existence. Gym membership. Wine storage. Private aviation service. Every luxury he'd stopped noticing because they were simply there, all cancelled, suspended, terminated with the surgical efficiency of someone who knew exactly which threads held his life together. He needed his office. Files, contacts, the private safe with emergency cash. He still had access to his own damn office. The Hanwoo building rose 43 stories of steel and glass, his name literally engraved in the lobby directory. Park Ji-hoon, chairman. Not anymore. Security stopped him at the turnstiles. Young Soo, who'd bowed to him every morning for 6 years, now positioned himself like a border guard. I'm sorry, Chairman, Young Soo caught himself. Mr. Park. Your building access has been revoked. My office is on the executive floor. I have personal property. Security will inventory and deliver personal items within 72 hours. Those are the instructions. From Layla. Unspoken but understood. Young Soo, we've known each other for years. Just let me up to. I can't, Mr. Park. The guard's eyes held something between pity and fear. The look of a man who'd learned overnight that loyalty to the fallen was professionally suicidal. Please don't make this difficult. In the reflection of the lobby's glass walls, Ji-hoon saw what Young Soo saw, a disheveled man in a 2-day-old suit, desperate and powerless. Not the chairman who'd strode through these doors with an entourage. Just another person being denied entry. He turned away, past the limestone fountain he'd commissioned, past the commissioned art installation celebrating Hanwoo's visionary leadership, past employees who suddenly found their phones fascinating as he walked by. The executive elevator, his private elevator, required a biometric scan plus a 6-digit code changed weekly. He'd memorized every code for 5 years. His palm pressed against the scanner. Red light. Access denied. Of course. Ji-hoon took the public elevator to the parking level, crammed between junior analysts who fell silent when they recognized him. 37 floors of excruciating quiet, broken only by someone's poorly suppressed snicker at the 19th floor. His parking space, marked with a brass plaque reading Chairman, held a silver Genesis that wasn't his. Someone had already been promoted, the space reassigned, his entire identity overwritten before his car's leather had cooled. His own Porsche sat 3 rows away in visitor parking. A yellow boot clamped on the front wheel. A repo notice plastered on the windshield. Ji-hoon stood there, designer suit clinging to his back in the underground humidity, staring at the physical manifestation of his irrelevance. He had no driver to call. No assistant to handle this. No corporate card to pay the outstanding balance. He called a taxi with the app on his phone, still working, one of the few services not yet cancelled, and waited by the garage entrance like any ordinary person whose life hadn't imploded. The first drops of rain began as the taxi arrived. Fat, heavy drops that signaled the summer monsoon building over the Han River. The driver didn't recognize him. Didn't bow. Didn't call him chairman. Just asked for the destination in bored Seoul dialect. Ji-hoon gave the Hanam-dong address, then remembered the penthouse wasn't his anymore either. The prenup. Everything. Wait, change of plans. The Shilla Hotel. Credit card or cash? Card. Need to see it first. Been too many declines today. Ji-hoon pulled out his personal debit card, the one connected to the account that should still have money from last month, before Layla's lawyers froze everything. The driver examined it like a bouncer checking suspicious ID, then shrugged. Meters running. The rain intensified as they pulled into Seoul traffic. Through the water-streaked window, Ji-hoon watched his city transform into something unfamiliar, a place where he had no name, no power, no one waiting for him. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Your belongings from the office will be delivered to the Shilla front desk. Please collect within 24 hours or they will be disposed of. Not even his personal items were worth storing. Ji-hoon Park, who'd never carried his own luggage, who'd had staff to handle every inconvenience, would be collecting his possessions from a hotel lobby like a guest checking out after a disappointing stay. The rain hammered the taxi roof, and Ji-hoon felt the city washing him away, another name, another scandal, another cautionary tale Seoul would forget by next quarter's earnings reports. She was standing under the Hanwoo building's main awning when Ji-hoon's taxi pulled away, leaving him stranded in the downpour with a cardboard box of office belongings rapidly disintegrating in his arms. Layla. But not Layla. The woman he'd married wore soft cardigans and reading glasses, pulled her hair into messy academic buns, favored muted colors that didn't demand attention. She'd made herself small, forgettable, the kind of beautiful that didn't threaten or challenge. This woman wore power like a second skin. Charcoal Armani suit, sharply tailored. Hair in a sleek low chignon that exposed the elegant line of her neck. Had her neck always looked like that? Cartier tank watch catching the gray light. She held a black umbrella, perfectly dry, perfectly composed, while he stood drowning 3 meters away. Their eyes met. Ji-hoon's carefully rehearsed dignity evaporated. You used me. His voice cracked on the accusation, rain plastering his hair to his forehead, his $2,000 suit reduced to soggy fabric clinging to his frame. The cardboard box sagged dangerously, threatening to dump his professional life into Seoul's gutter. Layla didn't move. Didn't offer shelter. Just watched him with the clinical interest of a scientist observing expected results. I used you. Her voice was silk over steel. That's an interesting interpretation. You married me for my company. For access. You played the quiet academic while plotting. I married you, she interrupted, because you presented a legally binding contract that outlined the exact terms of our relationship. I signed it. I fulfilled every obligation. You're the one who confused a business arrangement for something else. That's not, we had a marriage. We had an agreement. She took one step forward, Louboutins clicking on wet pavement. Still under the awning. Still dry. You wanted a respectable wife for board meetings and corporate photos. I provided that. You wanted someone who wouldn't question your schedule or your loyalty. I provided that too. You said you loved me. Even as he said it, Ji-hoon couldn't remember when. Couldn't recall a single instance of those words from her lips. No, Layla said softly. You assumed I did. Because in your worldview, how could I not? You were the brilliant CEO, the youngest chairman, the man who hung the moon. Surely that guaranteed devotion. The rain hammered harder. Water ran into Ji-hoon's eyes. You destroyed my life for what? Revenge? You could have just divorced me quietly. Taken your settlement and... There was no settlement to take, Ji-hoon. Her tone was educational now, patient, like she was explaining basic concepts to a struggling student. I wasn't an accessory to your empire. I was the foundation. She shifted the umbrella slightly, and Ji-hoon noticed the leather portfolio under her arm. She extracted a document, held it just inside the rain's reach, close enough for him to see, far enough to stay pristine. Hanwol Dynamics Biotech Pivot. 7 years ago. You needed 40 million in capital. Your father refused because he didn't believe in the pharmaceutical shift. Do you remember where you got the funding? Ji-hoon's teeth chattered. Not from cold. Multiple investors. Venture capital. I assembled a 12 million from my doctoral trust fund. 8 million from my mother's estate, liquidated early with penalties. 5 million from my grandfather's research foundation. 15 million borrowed against my family's Gangnam properties. She lowered the paper. 40 million, Ji-hoon. Everyone you needed. All traced back to me through structures you never questioned because you were too arrogant to imagine your wife understood finance. You said it was an investment in us. In our future. It was. Her smile was arctic. I invested in a company I intended to own. I built my future. You were simply the talented operator I hired to run it. The words detonated in Ji-hoon's chest. All those late nights he'd worked, all the brilliant strategies he'd executed, all the innovations he'd pioneered, performed on a stage built with her money, managed by a board she'd quietly cultivated, within a legal structure she'd designed while he'd been too busy feeling exceptional to notice. Why? His voice broke completely. If you never loved me, why 8 years? Why not just buy the company outright? Why the marriage charade? Layla tilted her head, studying him like a specimen that had finally revealed its most interesting characteristic. Because Korean boardrooms in 2017 didn't respect unmarried women, especially foreign-educated ones. They respected wives of powerful men. So I became that. I played the role you needed while building the infrastructure you never saw. You're a monster. No. She closed the portfolio. I'm what you created. You wanted a wife who didn't challenge you, who stayed quiet, who knew her place. I gave you exactly that. The mistake was yours, assuming quiet meant weak. Assuming observation was ignorance. Assuming the woman organizing your life couldn't organize your destruction with the same efficiency. A black Mercedes pulled up to the curb. Her driver, not his former driver, someone new, stepped out with a second umbrella, shielding Layla as she moved toward the car. Wait. Ji-hoon lurched forward, the cardboard box finally giving way, his belongings spilling across wet concrete. Awards, photos, the desk nameplate that had read Chairman Park Jae-hoon. What happens now? To me? Layla paused at the car door, glanced back over her shoulder. For just a moment, something flickered in her expression, not quite pity, not quite satisfaction. Just the calm acknowledgement of a theorem proven correct. You survive or you don't, Ji-hoon. That's no longer my concern. She slid into the Mercedes, the door closing with the soft finality of a vault ceiling. You were never my responsibility. You were always just my investment. The car pulled away, red taillights bleeding into the gray afternoon rain. Ji-hoon stood alone on the sidewalk outside the building that bore his family name, surrounded by the waterlogged debris of his former life, finally understanding the truth that had been obvious from the beginning. He'd never seen her. Not once in 8 years. He'd seen a quiet wife, a convenient partner, a woman too grateful to be dangerous. He'd never seen the architect. The investor. The woman who'd built his cage with such meticulous care that he'd mistaken it for a kingdom. The rain washed over him, and Ji-hoon Park, former chairman, former husband, former master of his universe, had no umbrella, no car, no destination. Just the devastating clarity of hindsight and the cold soul rain. Ji-hoon walked. Not toward anything. Not away from anything specific. Just walked through Seoul's Gangnam district as the monsoon rain erased the boundaries between sky and pavement, between the man he'd been and the void he'd become. No destination. No umbrella. No one waiting. The city moved around him with indifferent choreography. Businessmen huddled under shared umbrellas, laughing about something he'd never know. Couples darted into cafes, shaking water from designer bags. Students clustered at bus stops, absorbed in phones that didn't display his scandal, his downfall, his irrelevance. Seoul had already moved on. Ji-hoon Park, youngest chairman, biotech visionary, the name that had opened doors and silenced rooms, was already forgotten. Not controversial enough to hate. Not important enough to remember. Just another cautionary tale the city would metabolize and excrete by next quarter's news cycle. He'd spent 38 years believing he was the protagonist of some grand narrative. The brilliant son. The revolutionary CEO. The man who'd transform Korean pharmaceuticals and leave a legacy that would outlive him. But protagonists don't get written out of their own stories. They don't become pedestrians in someone else's plot. Water ran into his eyes, rain or tears, he couldn't distinguish anymore. His feet carried him past the Hermes flagship where he'd bought Naun that bracelet. Past the restaurant where he'd proposed to Layla with a ring that cost more than thought. Past the private club where board members had toasted his chairmanship, their loyalty as temporary as the champagne bubbles. Every landmark was a monument to arrogance. He believed power was his birthright. That brilliance exempted him from consequences. That the rules governing ordinary people were suggestions for men of his caliber. He'd confused his title with his identity, his wealth with his worth, his position with his person. Strip away the chairman title, and what remained? Ji-hoon stopped walking, stood in the middle of a Gangnam intersection as the crosswalk signal counted down. Around him, umbrellas flowed like a river parting around a stone. No one noticed. No one cared. He was just another body occupying space, remarkable only in his drenched stillness. Who was he without Hanwol dynamics? Without the performance of power, the expensive suits, the deferential staff, the awe in people's eyes when they learned his name? Without the validation of boardrooms and business journals telling him he mattered? Nobody. He was nobody. The realization should have been devastating. Instead, it arrived with strange clarity, cold and factual as the rain itself. All those years of building his empire, he'd never built a self. He'd constructed a role, then confused performing it brilliantly with being someone worth knowing. Layla had seen it immediately. That's why she'd never loved him, there was nothing to love. Just ambition wearing a handsome face. Just ego dressed in Tom Ford. Just emptiness demanding constant admiration to feel substantial. She'd married the role and invested in the performance, but she'd never confused the actor for a person. She'd been honest about the transaction from the beginning. He was the one who'd lied. To himself, most of all. The signal changed. The crowd moved. Ji-hoon moved with them, anonymous in the stream of humanity he'd spent decades elevating himself above. No one recognized him. His face, plastered across morning news sites, had already faded from public consciousness by evening commute. Irrelevance was efficient like that. He thought about the women, Naun and all the others, who'd whispered that he was magnificent. They'd been right, in a way. The performance was magnificent. The chairman of Hanwol Dynamics was an impressive construction, a compelling character, someone worth admiring. But Ji-hoon Park? The man underneath? He'd never asked himself that question. Never needed to. The role had been sufficient. Until the role was revoked. Now he was just a man walking through rain in a ruined suit, carrying nothing, going nowhere, mourned by no one. The city's neon signs reflected off wet streets, Samsung, Hyundai, LG, all the names that mattered. His name wasn't among them anymore. Wouldn't be again. Somewhere in Seoul, Layla was probably reviewing quarterly projections, making decisions about the company she'd always owned, living the life she'd meticulously planned while he'd been too self-absorbed to notice. She'd won so completely that victory looked effortless. But this wasn't about winning or losing. It was about clarity. Ji-hoon Park had spent 8 years married to a woman he'd never seen. 38 years building a life he'd never examined. Decades performing power without understanding its actual nature. Power wasn't domination. It was observation. Patience. The discipline to play a long game while your opponent celebrated short-term victories. Layla had understood that from the beginning. He was only learning it now, too late, in a rain-soaked city that had already forgotten his name. The walk continued. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, time had lost meaning along with everything else. Eventually, Ji-hoon found himself on a bench near the Han River, watching water flow toward the Yellow Sea with ancient indifference. The rain had stopped. The city sparkled, washed clean, ready for tomorrow's dramas. Ji-hoon Park sat in his drenched designer suit, no longer chairman, no longer husband, no longer anyone's definition of exceptional. Just a man. Finally, brutally, just a man. And in the devastating quiet of his own irrelevance, something shifted. Not redemption, he hadn't earned that. Not forgiveness, he didn't deserve it. Just acceptance. The performance was over. The curtain had fallen. The audience had left. What remained was the question he should have asked 8 years ago, 38 years ago, before he'd built an empire on someone else's foundation and called it his own. Without the title, without the admiration, without anyone watching. Who are you? Ji-hoon didn't have an answer. But for the first time in his life, he understood that was the only question that had ever mattered. 3 months later, Ji-hoon Park read about his own irrelevance in the business section of the Korea Herald. Hanwoo Dynamics posts record quarter under new leadership. Dr. Layla Kim, formerly Kim Park, has steered the biotech giant to unprecedented growth following last quarter's leadership transition. The Cambridge-educated biochemist, who assumed the chairman role after her former husband's departure, has announced 3 major pharmaceutical partnerships and a groundbreaking gene therapy initiative. His name appeared once. In the 6th paragraph. A footnote to someone else's success story. Replacing former chairman Park Ji-hoon, who stepped down amid personal controversies. Stepped down. As if he'd had a choice. As if the collapse had been voluntary, dignified, anything other than total obliteration. But that was the genius of it, Ji-hoon realized, sitting in his studio apartment in Mapogu, the kind of place junior analysts lived, where the walls were thin and the view was of another apartment building's walls. Layla hadn't just taken his company. She'd taken his narrative. History would remember her brilliance. His infidelity would be a minor detail, a character flaw that explained the transition but didn't define it. He wasn't the protagonist brought low by a vengeful wife. He was simply the man who'd been there before the real story began. The cruelest punishment isn't public humiliation. It's erasure. Being written out of your own story while still alive to read it. Ji-hoon set down the newspaper, a physical copy he'd bought from a convenience store because he couldn't afford digital subscriptions anymore, and stared at the ceiling of his 30-square-meter existence. The apartment smelled like the previous tenant's kimchi and his own failure. He'd spent 3 months waiting for the rage to return. For the righteous indignation that would fuel his comeback, his redemption arc, his triumphant resurrection. That's how these stories were supposed to work. The fallen king regains his throne, wiser and humbled. But the rage never came. Because Layla had never lied to him. She'd answered the question he'd posed 8 years ago with the prenuptial agreement: what are the terms of this arrangement? She'd simply read the contract more carefully than he had. Played the game by rules he'd been too arrogant to learn. Won so completely that winning looked like patience rather than strategy. The divorce hadn't destroyed him. His arrogance had. The belief that quiet meant weak. That observation was ignorance. That the woman organizing his calendar couldn't possibly be organizing his downfall with the same meticulous attention. He'd built an empire on her foundation and called it his vision. She'd let him perform that delusion for 8 years, waiting with the patience of someone who understood that time was an asset, not an enemy. And when he'd finally broken the contract, repeatedly, carelessly, with the confidence of someone who thought consequences were negotiable, she'd simply enforced the terms. No drama. No tears. No mercy. Just execution. Dr. Layla Kim had reclaimed more than a company. She'd reclaimed her name, dropping the park that had never belonged to her anyway. She'd reclaimed her position as the architect rather than the accessory. She'd reclaimed her narrative from a man who tried to make her a supporting character in his story. The woman he'd underestimated hadn't won by being louder, angrier, or more ruthless. She'd won by being precise. Patient. Present while everyone else was performing. Ji-hoon's phone buzzed, a burner he'd bought after his old number became unusable, flooded with journalists and creditors and people who wanted to document his fall. A text from an unknown number. I hope you're well. L. 5 words. No threat. No gloating. Just acknowledgement that he still existed somewhere in her consciousness, filed away like a completed project. He didn't respond. What would he say? That he finally understood? That he'd learned the lesson? That he was sorry? Apologies were performances for audiences, and no one was watching anymore. The Han River flowed outside his window, he could see a sliver of it between buildings, grey water moving with the same indifference it had shown the night he'd walked through rain, drowning in his own obsolescence. Power, Ji-hoon had learned too late, doesn't fall loudly. It doesn't crash with dramatic thunder or spectacular explosions. It doesn't give you the dignity of a memorable ending. It collapses quietly, while you're still admiring yourself in the mirror. While you're still believing the applause, still convinced that loyalty is a given and consequences are for lesser men. It slips away in the shadows, dismantled by the person you never noticed was holding the blueprints. And by the time you realize the cage was never yours, that you were always the one being contained, the quiet one is already gone. Walking away in Louboutins. Holding every key. Writing the story that remained after your name faded from the credits. Ji-hoon Park closed his eyes and finally accepted what Layla had known from the beginning, he'd never been the author of his own story. Just a character in someone else's carefully plotted narrative. And the most brutal truth of all. She'd written a better ending without him than he could have ever written for himself. The arrogant don't get redemption arcs. They get footnotes. And if they're lucky, if the woman they underestimated is feeling particularly generous, they get to live long enough to understand exactly how they destroyed themselves. One careless betrayal at a time. Somewhere in Seoul, in a corner office overlooking the city that had forgotten him, Dr. Layla Kim reviewed quarterly projections and approved pharmaceutical partnerships that would save lives and generate billions. She never thought about Ji-hoon Park. Why would she? He'd served his purpose. The investment had matured. The contract had been fulfilled. And the quiet ones? They don't waste time on past mistakes. They build empires while everyone else is busy underestimating them.
If you enjoyed the story this far, don't let it end here. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next chapter and enjoy more story from us. And if this story gave you chills, drop a like and share it with someone who loves powerful romance with a dangerous edge. Your support keeps these stories coming. Thank you.